Hi, so let's start with a very interesting study. This is one of my favorite studies. There was a study done with heart patients, and when they were coming out, the doctors had said to them, if you don't make lifestyle changes, smoking, diet, exercise, you will literally die in a year, right? So when they came out, they were interviewed, and they said, okay, would you make these changes? And they said, of course, we're going to die, right? This has everything that you need for change to happen, right? There's a clear call to action. There's urgency, there's importance, right? It's literally life-changing. How many people do you think actually made this change? 1 out of 7. For something that's life-threatening and has everything. So today, if we're talking about intent to impact, this is the issue. I've spent my master's degree trying to learn this, right? How do we move from aha to transformation? There's a saying in Marathi, karta pan vart nahi. Just because you know, you don't change, right? So how do we make change happen? At Inclusional, we work with inclusion, but also with safety. And we have the same problem. We've spoken to hundreds of companies, and nobody's ever told us safety is not important, right? It's essential to running a business, and everybody agrees that they care about it. There's a law that requires you to do it. So everything's in place for you to do safety right. And yet most organizations stop at compliance. They might be compliant, but are they necessarily safe? And this is something we've been thinking a lot about at Inclusion, and we've been trying to figure out how do we change this story, right? And I'm giving you a very tiny sliver of some of our lessons from there. Let's put it on a maturity level, right? On a spectrum of the different kinds of companies we speak to. On the very left would be the reluctance, right? People who are saying diversity is not important, we don't care about diversity, we don't want diversity. This is a conversation for another ACOM summit, so I'm not going to go into this population. This is the population that we know of. A lot of organizations, this is where the DEI work begins, right? They're unaware. They don't know how important this is or what this looks like on ground, right? The solution there is really simple. The gaps are knowledge gaps. You give them data, you give them facts, you explain what's important, you inform them, and the change begins there, right? So we start there. But very often that is not enough, right? Till here it's the technical change, right? You're giving expert information and change is happening. But a lot of people know this. But the point is they don't really care, right? I know this, I know it's important, but do I really care? When we talk about do I really care, that's an emotional conversation, right? Do you have the emotions to care? And when I'm talking about emotions, emotions are data, right? That's how our body processes data. Our bodies have a sense of this is how the world should be, and then we experience the world as it is. And when that gap is too large, that's where your emotions stem, right? And like basic law of physics, when that gap is enough, that's what drives motion. And that's the same here, right? We keep saying in terms of safety, is you can't think safety, right? I can't tell you, kal se na aap sab safe feel karna. That's not going to change things. Just having a policy is not going to make you feel safe. You either feel safe or you don't. Similarly, safety feeling is not lack of harm. It's an active feeling that I need to feel, right? And that's the emotion part that we're talking about. And that's where compliance doesn't translate into safety. And for this, you need stories. Think about the stories you've heard today. In all probability, you're not going to remember the data. You're going to remember the stories we heard today. And those stories weren't the big dramatic ones, right? There are spaces for which the big dramatic stories are important. And there are spaces where the little stories that you can remember, that you relate to, where there's an emotion that you understand, that has a certain impact. So for this group of clients, the stories of safety matter. For people who care, the next stage on a maturity model would be people who say, I care, but only until it's convenient, right? When it gets inconvenient, I might not care as much about this. It's not, again, the lack of them wanting to do something, but the trade-offs come in when it's inconvenient, right? When we're talking about inconvenience, there are trade-offs. And a lot of our diversity conversations are about these trade-offs. Here, the gap is values and priority, and not the values you put in your branding statement, right? Not the values that you say, these are good things for me to talk about. It's the values you live your life by. When push comes to shove, what are you making their choices on the basis of? And for us, a question that we ask a lot of our clients when we talk about safety at this stage is if your star employee misbehaves with someone, and especially someone who's a fresher or someone who's in the front line, how much action would you take, right? And for us, that's a measure of values. Here, again, the star employee is measured by productivity, efficiency, perfection, right? Think of the values we're talking about in our organizations. These are values and measures of machines, not humans. Humans require safety. And the minute you're prioritizing your productivity, efficiency, perfection over safety, because these are the values that are easier to measure, this is what's happening and where a lot of safety initiatives get stuck, right? So how do you move past this gap? There's parts of it that we know, right? The carrot stick approach for us to go into organizations and tell them, if you don't do this right, here's the impact on productivity, on efficiency, on your employee performance, financial performance, etc., right? You're telling them how this links to your values. And if you think of a lot of our DEI presentations, they're often that, right? We tell them, aapki productivity, top line, bottom line pe ye fark padega. But the other part of the values is also we want to have good values. We want to do good. And how can our DEI interventions inform those parts of us that want people to move to action, right? Where we are saying when push comes to shove, choose the values that are more human, choose inclusion. And how do we make that happen with organizations? The role models, the things you celebrate. If your star performer is also being celebrated or denounced for their misbehavior, they probably might not be their star performer, right? So what you're measuring in that sense, what you're celebrating in your organization, the story that you're telling is important. I had a mentor who once said, anything that needs to be glorified often hides in plain sight something that's problematic. Because the only time you need to glorify something is probably because you want to get people to be okay with something that they shouldn't be okay with. So pay attention to what organizations glorify. Very often your lack of inclusion might probably be coming from there. For organizations who get this right, the next stage, they start but don't see it through, right? They get stuck at a certain point. This is actually, when we're talking about values and priorities, this is where your values come from, right? So we've spoken about how values bring emotions. The gap between what is and what should be is your values. Your values come from mindset, beliefs, assumptions, right? This is what you've inherited, what's been passed on to you, what is in your organizational history. So for example, a lot of companies, when we sort of speak to them about safety in organizations, they come and say, lekin isse complaints बढ़ जाएगी. This shows your mindset towards complaints, right? Complaints is not a way for you to resolve something, to make something better. But for you, that's taking away perfection. And that's the trade-off that you're making, right? One false complaint from a woman and you will never hear the end of it, right? And you will say women do false complaints, they misuse a law. Laws are misused, right? We don't stop having signal because people break signals. But when there's so many complaints by men and you would still hear not all men, right? That's a mindset problem. That's the beliefs that we've inherited. Another belief that we all come from, which often is a hindrance to inclusion, is this belief, the pull up your bootstraps, right? Compromise thoda to zaruri hota hai. To rise in your career, you've got to do it. And we see the things that are being wronged as a compromise for you to be okay with. These are the mindset levels which is why people don't finish what they've started when it comes to inclusion and even something as simple as safety. The solution there is to inspect beliefs, right? The reason this level is really hard to do is our mindsets, our beliefs, our assumptions are linked to our sense of identity, to our sense of worthiness, to our sense of belonging. The minute you start to question it, your sense of being in the world is threatened. And that's why it's so hard to change at this level. So this level requires support. Your ERGs to be truly effective, this is the level where the support comes in, where they give you enough security for you to change your mindsets and beliefs without feeling like your identity, worthiness, belonging is threatened. And lastly, for organizations who move past this, what we call leading in a maturity model, would be the change at a systemic level, right? We've heard a lot about this today. If you hear most panels, they've spoken about the systemic changes that are happening. And when I'm saying systemic changes, it's not just the infrastructure, it's not just the policy. But in one of the previous talks, they spoke about the interactions between people, right? What are the dynamics in the organization? And what emerges from there? Is your system designed for safety? Is it designed for inclusion? Or that's an add-on that you later try to adapt into your system? And the solution at this level is actually imagination, right? And it's sort of what Harish spoke about, is there's actually no law preventing you from having accounts for people of the same gender, couples of the same gender, right? You just need to imagine it. And a lot of reasons our inclusion efforts fail is at this level. We can't even imagine a world differently. Our default is to say, this is how the world is, please adapt to it. The world is not going to adapt to you. And we were all taught like that, and one of the reasons we are so threatened by Gen Z is they come with imagination, right? And then say, what if the world could be different? And they're starting there, and that's a mindset of curiosity, wonder, that we need if we have to make inclusion happen. One, if you all want to take pictures, a slide with everything. But this is what I want to conclude with, right? It's not that change doesn't happen because people don't know what change is. And that's why diversity inclusion initiatives need to stop being just about knowing. Change is inconvenient. Changing status quo is inconvenient, right? Status quo is teda hai par mera hai, right? We know it doesn't work, but it's familiar, and we get way too used to it because adaptation is another virtue that we actually give a lot of credit to, and it's important. But sometimes we're okay with things being wrong because status quo is so familiar and so convenient. So can we imagine differently and begin to build it and create what is required to do that inconvenient work? Thank you.